Hello generations, young, old, and everyone in between. Welcome to Generation Apollo, where we are the future. And I'd like to open up the first official topic video of my channel by covering something that's been bugging me for a very long time now. I've noticed that my generation, the Millennials, and those generations coming in behind us, are facing a world that is determined to see us fail. And if you think that sounds pretty crazy, well, you don't have to look very far to see proof of that.
Here to launch, a new Pew Study Center shows that millennials, those between 18 and 34, less likely to be living on their own now than they were during the Great Recession.
In Money Watch, a recent survey is highlighting struggles the millennial generation is having with money. The 2017 survey by Go Banking Rates found that most millennials ages 18 to 24 have less than $1,000 in their savings account, while nearly half had nothing saved at all.
While looking at millennials above the age of 24 is more promising, the rate of millennials with $0 saved is on the rise.
I don't know. I've never heard of this avocado toast thing. But I'm not.
It's hot.
I mean,
it's very hot.
And the price has gone up of avocado.
Yeah.
So
yeah,
it's
I
expensive
guess
too.
it's a $2 avocado and a 30-cent piece of bread. I would say this: the reality is that millennials aren't buying homes because of the student loan debt. I mean, on average, they're graduating with $37,000 in student loan debt. That is not something that baby boomers or traditionalists dealt with. That's the hurdle.
And if that wasn't bad enough, not only are the younger generations failing, they've been brainwashed and conditioned to be so mentally fragile and unstable that many of them aren't even capable of fighting back.
This has to be a joke. I do not believe this is happening. I'm literally about to fucking kill myself, and I'm not kidding. You better fucking fix this shit right now. I literally am gonna die. I need an ambulance. I can't believe. Stop me!
Oh no! Oh, we should film it. Oh no! Oh no!
I don't give a fuck!
Back up! Your customer!
So as you can see, not only are young people failing, society is failing them. And this isn't just a coincidence, this is intentional by design. And who is responsible for this mess? Well, I blame a particular group of people whom I like to refer to as the architects of crisis. Now, this group consists of people of all ages, races, and religions. While many within this group have knowingly contributed to our current state of affairs, there are countless more who have unknowingly played their role in this group by way of their own ignorance. And I have narrowed it down to what I believe to be the three primary culprits, the three subgroups that comprise the architects. Now, which is the first subgroup? Well, to answer that question, let's have a look at the generation that raised the millennials. Group number one, the baby boomers. The baby boomers are undoubtedly the wealthiest and most prosperous generation in history, having been born into a time in America's history where there was an unprecedented amount of prosperity, thanks to the sacrifices made by their parents' generation. Unfortunately, due to policies that they voted on over the course of their tenure as stewards of this great nation, it seems that that prosperity wasn't passed on to their children. And considering how much wealth and opportunity was gifted to the boomers, that speaks volumes to their ability to be responsible, as well as the quality of leadership that their generation has given us. A leadership that, I feel, personally, could be best described as one of gross mismanagement and missed opportunities to use their collective wealth to better the world, or at least maintain the one that their World War II parents worked so hard to build and to give to them. That's because the boomers were the first generation in American history to be spoiled rotten, to be raised on television and commercialism, and, most importantly, to have the vast population numbers needed to outvote everyone else and always get what they want. Now, the truth is, there's really nothing all that super special about the boomers in reality. They were simply the first generation in history to be larger than any of the prior ones. And once they realized this, it didn't take them long to figure out that, hey, there's a whole lot of us around. We could simply vote to give ourselves everybody else's wealth and money. And that's what they did. They voted to give themselves more wealth and power, and no one could challenge them because they held a supermajority. And the boomers have no problem being arrogant about it either. Now, under normal circumstances, their behavior would have simply been lamentable. However, because they hold such tremendous influence, again, thanks to their supermajority, they are able to pressure politicians, businesses, and society in general to cater to their self-centered desires, no matter what the long-term consequences are for everyone else. And since we live in a democratic society, that basically means mob rule. Now, to be fair, any generation would have done this had they been placed in the exact same time and circumstances. If it had been the millennials that grew up in the 1960s, they would have made all the same mistakes. Yet, I have heard some people say that renders any criticisms of the boomers moot. No, it doesn't! Just because my generation would have made the same mistakes doesn't make the boomers' behavior any less reprehensible. And my, how the boomers have certainly used their power of numbers to their advantage. So, should it come as any surprise that the beginning of the decline in America's moral and economic standing just happens to coincide with the same point in time where the boomers came of age and began to achieve political influence? Think about it now. When the boomers were young, they were gifted an America where a typical house only cost 3 times the median annual salary, and a college degree didn't cost the equivalent of a mid-range sedan, so it was possible to cover tuition with a part-time job. And if you couldn't afford college, there were plenty of manufacturing jobs that paid a wage you could live on, and you could get with just a high school diploma, and not even that in some cases. But today, as the boomers are entering old age and preparing to walk off stage into retirement, we now see homes that once sold for $30 to $50K just a few decades ago now selling for $250,000. And forget about getting a decent paying manufacturing job because most of the factories have gone overseas now. Today, a college degree no longer ensures a solid path to a good paying job, yet the cost to attain a degree keeps rising every year. A bachelor degree now costs roughly 20 to 30 grand, and God help you if the job you want requires a master's or worse, a PhD. Then you're looking at over 100K easily. But if a degree doesn't go as far as it used to, then why are young people willing to go so far into debt to get one? Well, that's because baby boomer hiring managers still demand them. That's why. Now, before I go further, I'm not saying that all boomers are bad. This is kind of a requirement I gotta say. And it would be overly simplistic of me to blame the boomers for all of society's woes. But the fact that all the things I just mentioned happened during the boomers' leadership is as hard to ignore as the student loan debt hanging over my generation's head. And that brings me to the second subgroup of the architects of crisis. Number 2, the crony capitalist state. They say follow the money. Follow the money and you'll discover who's really in charge. Remember what I said about boomer bosses and hiring managers now demanding higher degrees for jobs that really don't need them? Is it because jobs have become more sophisticated to the point where higher degrees are needed? No, they haven't. Jobs that used to only require a diploma or a 2-year associate's now require the next degree level up for 2 reasons. Number 1, so employers can trap and exploit naive graduates. Think about this now. Employers know how much college costs these days. They're not stupid. They know that when you graduate with 30 grand in average student loan debt and you've got no job experience, you'll take whatever you can get. That means the employer has the upper hand when it comes to discussing salary. But an even more insidious way that employers like to exploit desperate college grads is through unpaid internships. Again, they know you have little to no job experience when you graduate and you're desperate for anything, so they'll often dangle a little carrot in front of you by promising you the potential for a paid position after the internship is done. Now, in all fairness, some employers do keep their promise and you do get experience that you can put on a resume. However, the vast majority of employers don't keep their promise. And then they give you the boot after the internship is done and they've gotten thousands, if not tens of thousands of dollars of free labor out of you. Now, if it were only small startup companies that were mostly soliciting these unpaid internships, at least that I could understand. You know, you got a small startup company, they don't have a whole lot of money, but you know, if you do a volunteer internship, you could at least have the potential to get in on the ground floor, and if not, you gain some experience. However, it is large companies that are some of the worst offenders for this. Large companies that have revenue streams in the millions of dollars, yet they can't afford to pay even minimum wage, not even compensate you for your traveling expenses like gas or bus fare or train tickets, whatever you use. That's where I call bullshit, and I call these unpaid internships for what they really are. Slavery. Unpaid internships are literally just one step above slavery. The only difference being that you can at least leave the internship anytime you want if you get tired of being exploited. But in my opinion, unpaid internships should be illegal for any company with profits in the 7-figure range. And I hope that even the most conservative among you out there will agree with that. And if you don't think that these unpaid internships are exploitation of the highest order, then you're either a Gen Xer or older millennial who's lucky enough to have enough job experience so where that's no longer an issue for you or never was an issue for you and you don't care what younger job seekers today have to deal with. Or you're one of those greedy baby boomer bosses or hiring managers I just mentioned who has no problem exploiting young people for free work. So, yeah, the number one reason why employers are demanding expensive college degrees is because it makes it easier for them to financially exploit younger workers. Now, reason number two of why degrees are still required, or why the boomers are still requiring them, and that is to limit access to jobs to those who are easier to exploit, and also to make life easier for hiring managers and HR departments. Now, whenever you see a company advertising a job opening, it's generally a safe bet that there are 100 other applicants for that position. Now, a hiring manager isn't going to sift through 100 resumes, they only want to see the top 5 to 10 candidates. That's why they often delegate the job of finding candidates to HR instead of just writing the job ads themselves, which would explain why you see so many job ads with ridiculous requirements, because they're written by people who have no experience in these jobs anyway. But the HR personnel don't want to sift through 100 resumes either, so they force you to apply online, and they come up with certain criteria that applicants must have in order to be considered for the position, regardless of whether the job actually requires that criteria. So, when you submit a resume online, it goes into a database, and if it doesn't contain the right set of keywords, like bachelor's degree, then it's likely to never ever be read by an actual person, much less end up on a hiring manager's desk. That's why I say if you're applying for a job, always try to find out who the hiring manager or business owner is and drop off your resume directly if possible, and just bypass the online application process altogether. It really does help your chances of landing a job. I speak from experience, trust me, because that's how I got my current job, as well as several past jobs before that. They say that inquiring in person is outdated and no longer a viable method of job hunting. Well, I say that's not entirely true. There is still something to be said about the old school method. It is still alive and well, even in the online age. So, at least that's one thing that the boomers are still right about, I suppose. Now, that's not going to be possible with every company, especially large corporations that go to great lengths to make it impossible for you to ever directly contact a hiring manager. But since anyone with 2 brain cells to rub together and half a shred of self-respect knows how miserable and soul-crushing it is to work in corporate America, those types of companies are usually best avoided if possible. Unless you're absolutely desperate and you need something. But, getting back to my original point, requiring an expensive degree, even for the jobs that really don't need them, is just another way for employers to separate workers who can be exploited for lower wages from those who are harder to take advantage of. If you have a 2-year degree and you didn't have to go into massive debt to get it, you're in a much better position to hold out for a better salary because you won't be desperate, and that's not what employers want. But I do have to wonder, how much longer is this going to keep up? Because in case you've been living on a deserted island for the last 25 years, you should be well aware of the quality of education that many colleges these days are providing. It's not uncommon to see college graduates coming out of university with a degree yet have little or no critical thinking skills. It's getting to the point where many college graduates are so woefully ill-prepared for the real world that they're not even useful enough to be exploited as wage slaves anymore. Or worse, they end up being indoctrinated into far-left ideology that's borderline communism. And that brings me to the third and final major subgroup of the architects of crisis. Group number 3, the Communist Marxist Legion. A recent survey claimed that as many as 75% of millennials support or have favorable opinions about communism. And that's not surprising considering the crony capitalist state has paved the way for this to happen thanks to 4 decades of stagnant wage growth and out of control inflation. But let's also not forget the role that academia has played in all of this. Young people no longer go to college to get an education unless you're going into law, medicine, or STEM. Most of them go to college with the intent of getting an education, but instead end up being indoctrinated into far-left ideology. I see it in the number of young protesters waving the old Soviet flag and sporting t-shirts with Che Guevara on it, and it scares the living crap out of me. When I see members of my generation embracing communism, I see history repeating itself in the same way that allowed Hitler to rise to power. How, you ask? Well, right after the First World War, the people of Germany were left impoverished and suffering an economic depression. So Hitler came along and promised to end their suffering, restore German prosperity, and even blamed an entire group of people for everything that was going wrong. And because the German people were so desperate for an end to their economic strife, they put their faith in a demigod, and look at where it left them. My point is that when you have an impoverished and desperate population, they are wide open to manipulation, and they will support any individual or ideology that promises to alleviate their suffering. That's what's happening to the millennials. As much as I hate to do so, but I have to give credit where credit is due, the communist Marxists are smart enough to at least recognize and seize on this opportunity to mold an entire generation to support their cause. And of course, it helps that the Marxists have slowly been infiltrating our academic institutions for the past few decades now. Those communists purposely distorted our education so that many members of my generation wouldn't have the facts or critical thinking skills needed to see through their bullshit. And who allowed these communists to take over our schools and colleges? Why, the boomers, of course, the same boomers whom we trusted to be stewards of our society. Many of the professors that educated my generation were former hippies, and many of them whom were communist sympathizers. But do I think the boomers and Marxists are working together in all of this? Not necessarily, or at least not in a large scale. That idea is stretching it a bit, even for me, and many of you who tune into my channel will see in future videos, I'm not afraid to explore wild theories. Instead, what I think is happening is the boomers are just letting the commies do what they will because it keeps us millennials distracted. Remember, the boomers are narcissists that will support and betray any cause whenever it benefits them or whenever it stops benefiting them. The boomers ultimately know that communism is bad and will have disastrous results, but they don't care about that, as long as the shit doesn't hit the fan until after they've checked out of this life. They're setting us up to ultimately finish what they initially supported in their youth, but later abandoned, and that being the goal of destroying capitalism, after the boomers have had their chance to milk capitalism for every last dime, of course. So, to sum up the situation we're facing, here's the condensed explanation in a nutshell. The baby boomers seized control because they had overwhelming numbers to do so. They then used this acquired power to force American society to cater to their selfish nature, which paved the way for crony capitalists and predatory corporate interests to wreak havoc on our free market system and hijack our government for their benefit. This, in turn, paved the way for the Marxists to brainwash the younger generations by convincing them that communism is the answer for their woes. And that's where we are now. That is what we're up against. Now, in short, I want to say this. Us millennials and other generations of youth are tired of being blamed for a dysfunctional world that we didn't create and didn't ask to inherit. We are tired of being called stupid and good for nothing due to the lack of a quality education that our elders failed to give us and then had the audacity to laugh at us for not receiving. We are tired of being called mentally deficient because we were indoctrinated by evil people with malicious intentions, while the elders who were supposed to guide and protect us stood by and allowed the mass brainwashing of my generation to occur. But most of all, we are tired of being lied to. We are tired of being fed misinformation by those who seek to control us for their own benefit. We are a product of our environment. An environment that was created by those who serve only themselves. Just remember, older generations, we are the future, whether you want to believe it or not. And when the time comes when you will need us to care for you in your older years, Will you be able to count on my generation to do the job and not hold the collective pillow over your faces while you sleep? I'm not saying I want this to happen, but this should give all you older generations out there something to really, really think about. Because if you, our elders, fail to take any accountability for this world that you have given us, then we will bring hell on earth to your doorstep. You underestimate us at your own peril. Just remember that. And that's all I have to say for now. Thank you all for watching. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe, and share to help me grow this channel so I can get the message out. And also, be sure to subscribe to me on BitChute as well as Minds.com. Both links will be in the description. So thanks again for watching, and thank you for tuning in to Generation Apollo.